This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All. In this episode, I'm joined by Kelly Morse, co-founder of 7030 Studio, a design practice with a mission to rewild urban spaces and reconnect people with nature. Kelly's work blends ecology, sustainability and creative design to transform how we experience the natural world. We'll be discussing the philosophy behind 7030 Studio, the challenges and rewards of integrating wild landscapes into urban environments, and how we can all bring a little more nature into our everyday lives.
So I am the daughter of a park ranger and a fish and game information officer. And I'm not quite sure what fish and game would translate to in the UK, but it's a group of scientists and communicators who look over the science coming in about wildlife and human interactions with wildlife. And then they make kind of the rules or the permits, but they're also doing a lot of education and conservation work. And that's really important to me. I didn't realize it until I got a lot older, that most people didn't have the childhood that I had. For instance, my sister and I, we would go up for a few weeks and visit our mom in Mount Rainier National Park, which is in the western side of the United States. And that my dad would be watching us during the summer while she was up there. Also unusual. And, there's pictures of me collecting seeds in an alpine meadow because the rangers, who are all just like people in their 20s and 30s, they thought that, okay, well, the kids, they're smaller, so they'll have less environmental impact on this fragile meadow. So let's tell them to go collect seeds. So there's a picture of me of like 6 years old doing this with my sister, wearing my mom's ranger hat, and we're just having fun. So that is the background that I came from. I also grew up surrounded by apple orchards, which I grew up in Washington State, which is one of the places that produces 80% of the apples for the United States and actually the world. And a lot of pesticides are used there. So I remember my mom running outside and taking down the laundry when the pesticide planes were going over. And we actually lost a dog to pesticides. And so that was very conscious to me as a child, and seeing migrant workers come through and with the pesticides, and then seeing kids from the migrant community being born without hands or missing limbs in very high numbers. So I was in this world there's a tension between my everyday lived experience of loving the land and yet also this mass production that was coming at the cost of animal life and human life so that other people can eat their apples. And I grew up in that space, and I eventually became a poet, and poets have to find other things to do because you can't make any money as a poet. So I became a literature professor, and I taught English as a second language. I worked at writing centers. And then a few years ago, actually around COVID, I decided I wanted to reorient myself towards using my skills to help the land and help people. And so then I began studying while still working and raising kids to become an ecological landscape designer. And my partner is a printmaker, my partner in life and art. And so he and I also started doing collaborations, especially once we had children, because we had a lot of grief about what our children were inheriting because we love the land so much and we're worried. And so that prompted us to start making these collaborations that were about accessing and processing emotions so that we can figure out ways in which we love the land, we're grieving for the land, and come up with new possible futures.
Fantastic. You can totally see why your background would have kind of led you to that point, because there's almost like a conflict there between, as you said, the good aspects of being outdoors and also the negative things that sometimes get pulled in generally by humans' actions. And you mentioned you set up your studio and you spoke about ecological art. Can you describe that for people?
Yeah. So, for instance, my landscape practice in design studio is called 7030 Design Studio, and it comes out of entomologist Doug Tallamy. He did a study a few years ago with Carolina chickadees, which are a bird that is part of my region where I live now in southeastern Virginia, that they found watching the chickadees, for instance, with baby chickadees can only eat soft-bodied insects. They can't eat seeds, just like baby humans. They can't eat solids right away. So the parent chickadees have to produce thousands, they have to go find thousands of caterpillars. They put up webcams and they found that on average, a parenting pair had to give the baby chickadees 500 caterpillars per hour in order for them to survive. And what they found was that when there were native plants around, there's more caterpillars because they have co-evolved with those native plants, and all of the babies in the nest survive. And then if the chickadees are in places where there is less than 70% native plants, that there is starvation within the nest because there's just not enough caterpillars around, because a lot of our non-native plants, the insects are not co-evolved, or in fact we make plants that insects don't like because we think that holes in plants are bad. So my ecological gardening standpoint comes from science-backed things like that, where we don't have to get rid of all of our non-native plants, but we need to change the ratios and bring up the ratio of plants that are indigenous to our regions, because the insects can't move around. Well, most of them can't. A few of them sadly have, but we need to create habitat and spaces for our indigenous animals, and like the animals of our place. So having water out for them, having shelter, having food, having places where they can reproduce. So I work that into my landscape designs. And then with ecological art, there's lots of different definitions of it, but for my partner and I, it is art that is centered on the environment. And there's the recognition that humans, we are a part of nature. A lot of times humans are seen as separate, and sometimes people don't even think of humans as animals, even though we are. So it is the idea of we are centering nature in the more than human world, but at the same time, saying the human world should come in and recognize its place joyfully, hopefully, within the more than human world.
So the art aspect of it, just to clarify, are you creating kind of permanent gardens and also temporary installations?
Yes. Again, it's kind of that poetry background where you have to do more than one thing to survive. But also, I want to do it. So I have my clients where I'm making private permanent gardens. And then with my partner, and sometimes we collaborate with other folks, we're making these installations. And what we've decided is important is to have the installations have two parts. One part is physical, so it will be at a museum or at a garden, but it comes and goes because museums have exhibits that change. But then we also have online platforms because we want to bring the community in. And in order to do that, we want to get rid of the barriers of access, if you have to be at this particular place at this particular time, and maybe even pay money to come and see this particular piece of art. That's a lot of barriers. And if we really want to envision a different future, we want to let everyone participate. And so putting things on web platforms on the internet is like 50% of what we do, so that everyone can participate. And then we have the art installation to kind of create a physical embodied space, because the web is kind of nebulous,
So you're kind of getting the best of both worlds, because I think people might not assume that the sort of digital sphere would lend itself to art that's concerned with the natural world.
Yes. And actually, we are directly trying to reorient ourselves over and over again to how we interact with these big systems. So for instance, the internet, it can be a great space. It can be a terrible space. It can be a space where we get caught in all these vortexes and scrolling and influencers and things. But it can also be a space where we can connect with each other and we can hear voices we otherwise wouldn't get to hear. The same thing with our art. So for instance, the first piece, Hothouse, we took a traditional greenhouse kit, and then my partner screen printed these different beautiful maps and silhouettes of creatures in our region that are threatened by climate change, flood maps, different things. And then on the inside, with that project, we worked with an art educator, a muralist, and she created handmade paper for us. And then we printed out words that we got from the community that they were making up to describe their feelings about the environment. So taking, again, this thing of like the greenhouse, which traditionally maybe only has a few purposes, and saying like, well, let's reimagine a greenhouse and how can we grow our community inside this greenhouse? Because it's often about nurturing. And the same thing with the shipping container that we are using for our Soundmap gallery. How can we take this piece of equipment from this giant global system of shipping and reimagine it into something else that's more scalable to the average human body, to the average human person, and make something new out of it? And then again, add the Soundmap, which is where people can upload clippings. It can be recordings of a place that they love. Like literally, we have recordings of people, for instance, I think it's an island. Somebody took a recording of the sound of the pebbles on the beach. Somebody else took a recording of magnolia pods dropping, and people can upload these recordings or photos or conversations where they're talking to themselves about places they love or how the land has changed over time. And then we play those recordings in the gallery. So we're connecting these ideas that things that are being taken from the web, that community anywhere in the world, people anywhere in the world can contribute, and then we physically anchor them in the gallery or in the space of the art project.
It's amazing to have that as a kind of repository of these moments in time, these sounds, this input from individuals. And I think sometimes there's this kind of sense that I get that we don't actually know why we're collecting these things necessarily. And it might be that in centuries' time, somebody will go back and go, oh, wow, we've got this amazing catalogue of sounds. And from that, we can then extract this and we can work that out. And it will become so, so important in ways that we never could have imagined when we set out with the project. But I like that kind of not knowing aspect, that just doing because it feels right and trusting in the kind of process.
Yes, exactly. We are creating an archive. So for instance, with Hothouse, we encourage folks to come up with their own words for different feelings they're experiencing or different situations that they're starting to see happen because of climate change. And these can be words that are coming out of grief or coming out of joy or coming out of just any kind of experience. But we're all having all of these emotions, and climate is changing so fast that we can't catch up with our language. And so the idea is that we catch up with language with Hothouse. As we invent these words, then we have a common language and we can talk to each other and we can actually share. Because my partner and I, Brendan Baylor, we're of the belief that actually we all have a lot more in common, and every single human on this earth is experiencing climate change. And that if we could actually just listen and share with each other, that would give us renewed hope and would give us alternate possibilities. Be like, okay, we're going to save what we love. There's got to be other ways to do it. And that with Soundmap or Soundings, the other big project we're doing that, again, anyone, anywhere in the world can contribute. It is about listening, right? Because when you're listening, you are always listening with, right? You're listening with other people, you're listening with other species. We're listening beyond just the ear. Like, it is to listen, to really listen. It's about relating to people and relating to the outer world. There's no way to get out of listening without relationship. And so that also is part of it. By taking the time to listen to these sounds from all these different people, we are relating to them, and maybe we can find a different way forward. Maybe instead of all of this post-apocalyptic stuff, we can begin seeing new possibilities.
And it's very much the opposite of globalism at its worst, which is where everything just becomes this homogenous lump of brands and ways of speaking and ways of dressing that you kind of see if you travel now, as opposed to traveling 20 years ago. You see this mass branding and these mass produced products, and they're popping up across the world. Whereas what you're doing is sharing very, very individual experiences amongst people. So yeah, I love the idea of it. I will put links to where people can find those projects in the show notes, of course, and then people can go and contribute if they'd like to. So your work must be very kind of varied. You must have had some quite good fun doing your projects and been to many places and worked in many different environments. Have you got any kind of exciting examples of things that you particularly like doing or things that were really interesting?
Yes, but I have to tell you, Sarah, as you well know, like for instance, we're always scrabbling for funding, actually.
Mm.
And I think this actually is really important for people to think about, like with your podcast, with our art, that we've had people ask us sometimes, like, why are you doing this? Which is a funny question, because to us, we think, well, somebody has to do this and we're interested in it and nothing's going to change if we don't do this. But what people don't realize is that oftentimes there isn't funding for the arts. There isn't funding for this kind of interdisciplinary questing and seeking and exploring. And that we've never had anybody come to us and say, we're going to give you some money to make something, and can you make it for us? Like, that's something for actually a very, like 1% of artists in the world. Instead, it is very homegrown, which I hope helps people, because they might think, like, how did you make this installation? And we did it little bit by little bit by little bit, seeing a grant here and writing it, and talking to a nonprofit there and seeing, can they support us with a little bit of extra money? And knowing that our projects are not going to be what we want them to be at first. So in terms of Soundmap, our sound gallery, for instance, we applied multiple years before for a grant to get a shipping container, because we wanted to do a shipping container project, and we were denied. And so then we waited, and then we saw another grant come up, and we're like, okay, we're going to try again. And then this time we were given the grant money, but of course it's never enough. And so then we said, can we go and get a shipping container donated? And really what a lot of these projects are is this huge invisible labor to the public by community, by our friends, and having people come. For instance, a friend dropped off a pizza at 9 p.m. and we had to install the garden for the shipping container. There was a mix-up with when it was going to get dropped off in front of the museum, and I couldn't put the plants into the rooftop garden until the shipping container was dropped off in front of the museum as part of this big public arts festival that 10,000 people attend. And so the night before the opening, I and a bunch of friends, it was just my friends, just volunteers. We had almost no paid workers because we didn't have the money for it. They came and we formed a bucket brigade, and they lifted the plants up out of the U-Haul truck I'd gotten them from. I worked with 2 nurseries, wonderful local native nurseries. They'd loaned me plants. And then I got them in a U-Haul truck, and then we put up scaffolding, and then I was on top of the roof. And then people were literally, we had one person in the truck handing up plants to 2 more people on the scaffold who were putting them on the roof. And then I was putting them in place. And I remember we ate that pizza at 3 a.m. We didn't even get home till 6:30 in the morning. And some other friends said, hey, can we watch your kids for the night? And we said, thank you so much. And I think that's also important to know, because one of our friends joked, who had helped with the project, that when you go into the gallery space, it is so peaceful and serene and beautiful. And people actually don't even realize it's a shipping container until we tell them, because it's been transformed. And that they were like, wow, you would never know in the months long run up to this thing the chaos. It looks so chaotic from the outside.
I know what you mean. Yeah, I did a show garden, and yeah, that got built very much on a shoestring and with the assistance of very good people. So it was a bit of a crisis at the beginning of the build, and then it was turned into this most amazing place where people would go and actually come out crying because it was so sort of peaceful and out of this world. So yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, you've got this background of people scrabbling around like mad things trying to get it all done, and then the end result is just this lovely calm oasis. So yeah, that's really funny you say that.
Yeah, and I actually think it's really important for people to know that, because I think so often with art, or like a show garden, for instance, we only, as the viewer or the participant, we only see the finished product. And I think sometimes actually that can stymie people because they don't realize it all starts out with like, okay, let's sit down and have a coffee and look over grant possibilities. And then be like, okay, let's sit down at another meeting and let's have another coffee and let's start throwing around language for this grant, and then be like, oh man, there's not enough money. Okay, who can we connect with? And that it's just all these little pieces that end up being this beautiful thing, but we don't see that, right? And I definitely want people to know that through a bunch of tiny micro movements, they themselves can do it, right? And that we should see the messy, especially again in the world of the internet now, where we often see things that look so perfect, that actually it's messy, and that's okay. When I recorded, there's a little writing workshop that I did that's on the Hothouse website. There's a little video. It was 2020 when that happened. So we were supposed to go out into schools and the community, and I was going to do all these writing workshops, and I couldn't. And so then we pivoted and said, okay, we will make a short video workshop. And we literally had the computer propped up on our child's high chair on the living room table so that it was the right height. Like, this was not a professional setup in any way. And yet we did it. And now I'm glad that I made that video, because now it means that people all over the world can see the video, and people have contributed stuff from different places that otherwise wouldn't have been able to contribute.
Possibly, like, that's art in a nutshell, isn't it? It's like the traumatic delivery of something beautiful. So, if you think about how a lot of art's formed, that's probably quite a truism. As I said, I will link your work in the show notes and on my website so people can go and find you. But yeah, is there anything else you wanted to add before I let you go?
I think that, as you said, we are really interested in local embodied responses instead of these big systems. We want to know people's individual feelings and experiences, which comes out of this idea of counter mapping, which is where, again, we tell ourselves, I'm not a cartographer, I can't do that. I'm not an artist, I can't do that. But you know your space so well, and there's things only you know. And when we sit and actually listen to that space, or we think about our emotions, our grief, our love, then when we take the time to sit and process those things, we name them. And when we name them, that gives us huge power. And I think one of the things we are working towards is being able to share with each other in a way that comes from us, the common people. Because what can happen is, when we don't take time to sit and listen and share, then these other voices rush in, and they usually have their own agendas, and they have their own things they want you to think, right? And, like silly things like how for a long time there were politicians saying like climate change isn't real, or they're coming to take your cars, and really that is about petroleum executives keeping their grasp of their millions. And what we realized is that we want to get outside of all of the 24-hour news stream and the political posturing, and actually have the common people listen to each other and be able to come up with our own terminology, our own mapping, because in that way there's strength and resilience in our communities, instead of letting these outside voices that really often are not in our best interest tell us how we should be thinking, or like, oh, well, that emotion is this, and here's how you cure it. And it turns out it's usually about consuming something instead of connecting with the land. And so for us, this is a way of imagining our local communities having a voice in this big global world that sometimes doesn't really want us to have a voice. But I think that that's the future.
Thank you to Kelly for taking part in the interview, and thanks to you for listening. I just wanted to say that at the moment I'm suffering from ill health, and I'm not sure whether there might be a break in the podcast or not. I'm hoping that I shall continue, but there might be a week or two where there's a gap. So please bear with me. And also I wanted to say thank you to those people who've been donating via GoFundMe and signing up to the Patreon lately. It's really appreciated. I can't thank you enough for that support. So I will hopefully catch you next week. And yeah, thank you for listening. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.